Welcome everyone to Princess for a Day, the wedding dress in Victoria, 1840 to 2024. This talk is presented as part of the Seniors Festival and as part of the public program for our Belongings, Objects and Family Life exhibition currently on display in the Old Treasury Building until September 2025. My name is Katie and I'm Public Programs Coordinator at the Old Treasury Building. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the Old Treasury Building is on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Our presenter today is Margaret Anderson, Director of the Old Treasury Building. Margaret is a public historian who has worked in museums since the 1970s. Her research interests are in women's history, the history and demography of the family, and the presentation of history in museums. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Margaret for Princess for a Day, the wedding dress in Victoria.
Thanks, Katie, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. And can I just repeat Katie's acknowledgement? I'm also speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Now, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine a wedding dress. Now, of course, I can't see if you're really closing your eyes, but I'll give you all the benefit of the doubt. Now you can open them again. I'm willing to bet that the dress you imagined looked something like this, or even this. And if I was able to ask you why you imagine a wedding dress like that, you might very reasonably say to me, well, because it's traditional. And you'd be right. Perhaps you wore a dress like that, or your mother did. After all, how often on visiting our parents' or our grandparents' homes were we drawn to the wedding portraits on display? And did they look like this, perhaps? Or even earlier, like this? For most of the 20th century, almost every middle-class household displayed such a portrait in pride of place on the mantelpiece. And by the Second World War, that included most working-class families too. So your imagining of a white wedding dress in a formal style was probably bang on the mark. Now, as Katie explained, this lecture is part of a series we're presenting about objects included in our current temporary exhibition, Belongings, Objects and Family Life. One of those objects is a wedding dress. This wedding dress, worn by Elaine Colbert, née Smith, for her marriage to Dick Colbert in September 1947. Their wedding marked the beginning of family life for Elaine and Dick, as it did for the vast majority of Victorians from 1840. And the reason for that was simple, because for almost the entire period of Victoria's history, marriage between a man and a woman was the only sanctioned basis for family life. And that was the case regardless of class or creed. Of course, people could and did live together before marriage, but it was generally frowned upon. So one way or another, most families traced their beginnings from a wedding. But what sort of wedding? Well, here's the crunch. Because weddings can and did take many forms, from the simplest ceremony with a couple of witnesses to elaborate affairs with no expense spared. But over the period we're looking at, elements of the wedding day and the appropriate dress to be worn gradually solidified into a pattern that still survives today. We now call it traditional. But how did that tradition come to be? And how long a tradition are we actually talking about? And so for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to explore some of what we know about weddings and wedding dresses in Victoria, beginning in the middle decades of the 19th century. Now, perhaps the first thing to know is that in the 1840s and 50s, most people hoped to marry. Men generally looked for companionship, a sexual partner, a housekeeper, and perhaps a child to carry on the name. Marriage didn't affect their social status one way or the other very much. But for women, it was both a social and an economic imperative. Until well into the 20th century, becoming a wife and a mother was seen as a woman's primary role in life. Single women had much lower social status than married women and were universally looked down upon. The term spinster had negative connotations far beyond its legal definition, and that continued well into the 20th century. An unmarried woman in her 20s could be described as being, quote, left on the shelf, like old goods, and she was often an object of pity. Any woman brave enough to challenge the status quo could expect no sympathy at all from the commentators. And there were real economic imperatives too. Most middle-class women didn't work outside the home, and so were dependent on their families for support until they married. Labouring women, of course, did expect to work before marriage, but they only earned about half the wages of men. It was not enough for them to live on, especially not enough to support children on. And so most women were forced to consider marriage unless they had independent means, and almost none did. Those factors combined to create a very high marriage rate in Victoria. At times, when there was a marked imbalance in the sexes, the rates of marriage might fall. That was the case for men during the 1850s gold rush, for example, or later in reverse after the First World War, when there was an excess of marriageable women. But generally, most women did marry in Victoria, and they tended to marry younger than was common in Britain at the time. Now, since there was then no reliable means of contraception, they also tended to have large families. Families of 8 or more children were common. Mrs. Mudford, shown here in Kyneton in the 1890s, had 9 children, although there was one set of twins, as you can see. And she was in no way unusual. Now, the other thing it's important to know about marriage in the 19th century was that it was a life commitment, literally, till death us do part, as the Church of England marriage service put it. That was the promise that husband and wife made to each other before witnesses, and at first it was virtually impossible to dissolve it. With the exception of Quakers and Jews, the Church of England had a monopoly of the marriage service until 1837. And since the Church considered marriage to be a sacrament, it came under the legal jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts in England. Divorce or annulment was possible, but it was hugely difficult and extremely expensive, was way beyond the means of almost everyone. After 1837 in England, other churches could perform marriages, as could a civil registrar, but the rules on divorce remained. They changed gradually from the late 1850s, but at first divorce was only available on very unequal grounds. In Victoria from 1861, for example, both parties could obtain a legal separation on equal grounds. That was known as a judicial separation, but it didn't entitle either of them to remarry. Divorce was much more difficult, especially for women, because the different moral standards applied to the sexes meant that while a man could obtain a divorce simply on the grounds of his wife's adultery, a wife had to prove adultery coupled with either incest, bigamy, cruelty, or desertion, quote, without reasonable excuse for 2 years or more. It would be another century before divorce on equal grounds was enacted, by then part of the Commonwealth government's jurisdiction, and 1975 before so-called no-fault divorce was possible. So for a very long time, the decision to marry was a weighty one. And while it was quite possible for both husband and wife to be equally miserable in marriage, for women, the decision was especially crucial because once married, a wife literally became the property of her husband. This was symbolized in the Church of England marriage ceremony when the bride's father handed her to her future husband at the altar. This continues to be done, of course, but I suspect that very few now understand what that once meant. Now, interestingly, that practice has attracted controversy in Sweden recently, where the practice of a bride's father walking her up the aisle has begun to creep in. Swedish custom apparently had bride and groom walk up the aisle together. But taking their cue from various recent royal weddings and those of film stars and other prominent people, Swedes have begun to see brides walking down the aisle on the arms of their fathers. The Lutheran Church there is now trying to ban this practice, saying that it is patriarchal and, quote, not our tradition. However, in the Anglo-Saxon world, it was very much the tradition. And once married, a woman ceased to exist independently at law. There was a famous legal saying at the time, "My wife and I are one, and I am he." It was entirely accurate. A married woman did not control her own property, couldn't take independent legal action, and even wages that she might earn herself were the legal property of her husband. And that continued until the 1880s. If she was proved to be unfaithful to her husband, he could claim legal damages from her lover, and also divorce her, of course, with the proceedings often reported in local newspapers. Some quite sizable damages were awarded, as this report from 1949 makes clear. Now, all of this was understood by those who married in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So when we look at these pretty dresses and think about the wedding ceremonies, we need to keep all this in mind too. But in fact, what we find is that weddings and wedding dresses were much simpler affairs in the 1840s and 50s. Many people today think that a traditional wedding involves a bride in a long formal dress, perhaps wearing a veil and carrying a bouquet of flowers. But believe it or not, this is a relatively recent practice. In the mid-19th century, most brides did not wear white, which was never a very practical colour for obvious reasons. Many dress materials in the early to mid-19th century didn't wash well or even at all. And while, as we know, white, as we know, shows every mark. While wealthy women could afford to employ servants to do their laundry for them, most women had to do their own. And so white was not a practical colour at all. So women generally wore their best dress to be married in, usually in a coloured fabric that was the best they could afford. Wealthy brides wore silk, others either cotton or wool, depending on the season. And we see wedding dresses in museum collections in many varied shades and materials. Here are a few from local collections. As you can see, these dresses are neither white nor cream, although there are others that are. Purple seems to have become popular in the 1860s and 70s, probably because it was then one of the new colours created using synthetic aniline dyes. These dyes created an intensity of colour that was not possible before. And so women wishing to make a fashionable statement might well have turned to mauve or purple, as seen in these two dresses. The wedding itself was also a simpler affair than it would become later in the century. Most weddings in the 1840s and 50s took place in the morning. 8 or 9 seems to have been very common, sometimes with a wedding breakfast to follow if the family was prosperous enough. Now, that was because almost all marriages took place in a church. And since the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church regarded marriage as a sacrament, those participating were expected to fast beforehand. After taking Holy Communion, the couple could break their fast. Now, later, the term wedding breakfast seems to have referred to a meal served at any time after the wedding. But at first, it was just that, a breakfast, although often with a cake. So where did the practice of wearing a white bridal gown come from, and when did it become widespread? There is a general consensus that the fashion for white wedding dresses followed the example of Queen Victoria, who wore ivory satin when she married Prince Albert in February 1840. Reproductions of the wedding portrait circulated widely and encouraged wealthy families to follow suit. The fashion was cemented further when Princess Alexandra of Denmark also chose white for her wedding dress when she married Prince Albert in 1863. And she was the first royal bride to be photographed wearing her wedding dress, and the photograph circulated widely throughout the British Empire and beyond. The dress itself, preserved in the royal collection, was white silk satin trimmed with orange blossom, tulle, and Honiton lace, with a matching veil and a long silver moire train. You can perhaps see it better in the official portrait. The skirt had 4 deep lace flounces in the fashion of the day. Nevertheless, it took some time for the fashion for white wedding dresses to catch on. As we've said, white was not a practical colour for dresses, and it was rare for any bride to commission a dress to be worn only once. For a long time, that seemed like a scandalous expense, which is not surprising given the yards and yards of fabric that went into making these dresses, not to mention the days and days of sewing involved. Even Queen Victoria had her wedding dress remodelled, though clearly Queen Alexandra did not. Nor, incidentally, did Elaine Colbert, whose cream satin wedding dress from 1947 is featured in our exhibition. But my own mother, who married in 1950, had her ivory satin wedding dress made into an evening gown with a deep burgundy bodice. Sadly, it didn't survive the ministrations of 2 small girls using it for dressing up some years later. It's hard to be precise about just when it became common practice for a bride to be dressed in white. As we saw earlier, there were plenty of coloured wedding dresses in the 1870s and 80s, but there were also some brides who dressed in white or cream. This fashionable dress in white silk organza was worn by Penelope Bell Hawkins for her marriage to the Reverend John Whiteman Lawson in Portland in 1871. It's held in the collection of the Castlemaine Historical Society, where I photographed it in situ. Now, apologies for the reflections from the glass in this view of the back of the dress, but I wanted to show you that Miss Hawkins was entirely up to date in her dress design. Her 1871 gown features the latest draped and frilled apron effect in the skirt, with the fullness of the fabric sweeping to the back. As the 1870s progressed, this style would become more pronounced, of course, with the fullness at the back supported by a bustle. By the late 19th century, the weddings of the wealthy were often described in detail in the local press, and such descriptions helped to cement more general expectations of what was considered a proper wedding. That was supported by the publication of advice manuals, which purported to guide the uninitiated in appropriate etiquette for both dress and behaviour. So when Ethel Clark, daughter of Sir Rupert Clark of Rupert's Wood, married George Cruikshank in April 1895, for example, the Argus described the proceedings in detail, though the fashion-conscious were probably disappointed by the absence of a detailed description of Miss Clark's dress. Readers were informed only that her bridal dress was of pure white, while those of her attendants, in their white hats and dresses splashed with pink and blue, harmonised well with the bouquets they carried. The focus of the Argus correspondent was more on listing the number of prominent people who were in attendance. There was no such shortcoming in the Australasian's account of the wedding of Mary Chirnside to Reverend Brown at Werribee in September 1894. The Australasians correspondent at this time was someone who went by the nom de plume Queen Bee. And she, if indeed she was female, gave detailed descriptions of the bridal dress, those of her attendants, and finally the outfits of the more prominent women amongst the guests. Now, I have to say that the apparel of the men merited only the briefest reference. Now, perhaps Miss Chirnside was no great beauty, for Queen Bee described her instead as looking, quote, handsome and graceful, as she entered the church on her brother's arm, her father having died, incidentally. But the description of her dress was very detailed, and we're told that she wore a rich and beautiful bridal gown of ivory white satin duchesse, trimmed with Brussels lace in festoons on the skirt. The same lace was draped on the bodice to form a picturesque fichu, which was caught at one side with a trail and bouquet of orange blossoms. The long court train of satin was trimmed with a wide revere of Brussels lace and caught up with a bouquet of orange blossom. A wreath of the same flowers and a veil of the finest Brussels net covered her completely, falling over her face and reaching the end of her train. The bridegroom's gift, a diamond crescent, was worn in the hair. Now, what a shame there was no photograph. There was, however, a great deal more describing the decorations, the presents, including those from Lord and Lady Hopetoun, and listing the most important guests. The account was titled, as you can see, The Werribee Wedding, and I imagine that the emphasis was on the Werribee Wedding, and it filled several columns of newsprint, as you can see. Here, then, was the society wedding par excellence, a spectacle in every sense of the word, but also a standard for others to emulate. Wedding photographs preserved from the period suggest that this was becoming the model that the prosperous tried to replicate. But even in the 1880s and 90s, there were brides who resisted the trend towards the white bridal gown, as these photographs, this one taken in a Richmond studio in 1886, and this one taken in a Collingwood photographic studio in 1890, suggest. Even in quite prosperous families, like the Baker family of Horsham, photographed in about 1900, in a group portrait, and you can just see their maid there on the far right, the bride might still wear a coloured dress, as she does there in the centre. But the trend was definitely shifting towards the wearing of white. For society weddings, it seems to have been a requirement by about the 1890s or even before, if the many photographs in public collections are any indication. They're supported by any number of newspaper accounts. Here are two photographs that show what I mean. The first is the Wade family in Clear Lake in about 1900. The second family is not identified, but it was clearly a large and prosperous wedding in Bendigo in about 1905. And the most extraordinary thing I think about this second photograph is that they're amazing hats worn by many of the women. They are truly enormous, aren't they? Now, it's often assumed that wearing white for a wedding symbolised a bride's virginity. And by the 20th century, that may well have been one understanding. White, of course, has a long association with moral purity from classical symbolism onwards. If we think the Vestal Virgins in the Roman Empire who were said to have worn white robes, and later depictions of celestial beings in art, angels, for example, were traditionally shown in white robes. There was also a long historical tradition that prized virginity in women before marriage, but it is one of those so-called traditions that is closely linked to class and perhaps was more often honoured in the breach by others. The entire question of bridal innocence is itself a complex one. Since there was a very high rate of bridal pregnancy in earlier centuries, sometimes reflecting older customs of hand fasting or formal betrothal, which could sanction sexual activity before marriage, and sometimes probably reflecting differences between the customs of the nobility, who were primarily concerned with inheritance, or later a rising middle class, and those of ordinary folk. Some of the ordinary folk sometimes seem to have simply decided to formalise a relationship if a woman became pregnant. Others don't seem to have bothered at all. Estimates of bridal pregnancy in 19th century Australia vary a lot, but they suggest that somewhere between 18 and 35% of brides were probably pregnant on marriage. And that broad estimate reflects the findings reported from different demographic samples. Rates of illegitimacy may have been as high as 20% of all live births at some times. So it is possible that upwards of half of all brides were not actually virgins at the altar. And yet our belief in the symbolism persists. In the meantime, though, we certainly can't assume that those who married in coloured dresses in earlier decades were sexually experienced, any more than we can assume that those who dressed in white were pure. Now, you might have noticed that regardless of whether they wore a white dress or a coloured one, many of these brides seem to have worn a bridal veil. And here are some of the previous slides, just to refresh our memories. Of course, these are all brides from the 1860s or later, when photography was better developed. Before that, most brides seem to have worn bonnets or hats, sometimes with a tiny veil attached. Almost certainly, I think, the rise of the bridal veil from the middle years of the 19th century owed more to textile technology than to fashion itself. It was all very well for royalty to commission long bridal veils, but before the 1820s, even simple net had to be made entirely by hand. Lace in the sort of quantity required for a long veil was prohibitively expensive. From the 1840s and 50s, machine-made net was more widely available, and so much more affordable. So once again, while royal brides led the way, it gradually became possible for others to join them, as lace became less expensive. Nevertheless, veils were items of bridal clothing that didn't really lend themselves to remodelling, except as collars, cuffs, or dress trimmings and the likes. Instead, they were sometimes shared, or even passed down in families and worn many times. Elaine Colbert sent her bridal veil to England, for example, where it was worn by another bride. Janet Scrimgeour, whose veil we see here, arrived in Victoria as a child in 1854, and she sent to Ireland for her bridal veil for her marriage in Bendigo in 1865. The veil was made of Limerick lace and was passed down the female line in the family for 130 years to be worn by successive brides. It's now in the collection of Museums Victoria. Limerick lace, incidentally, was a form of lace made by embroidering patterns, hand embroidering patterns on machine-made net. So it was a sort of mixed lace, part machine, part handmade, and therefore sort of in between in terms of expense. But let's return to the wedding dress itself for a while. What we notice overall from bridal portraits and extant dresses is that whatever other traditions they may have adopted, brides in the 19th and for most of the 20th century dressed in the fashion of the day. In the 1850s and 60s, they married in crinolines, as here, the marriage of one of the daughters of the then governor of Victoria. In the 1870s, in the frilled and flounced frocks that were then in vogue. In the 1880s, they wore tight bodices and bustles. By the 1900s, collars were high and tight, while bodices often appeared loose and blousy. It was all an illusion, though, because beneath the drapery, bodices were boned and the lining close-fitting. Now, the only difference between these bridal frocks and ordinary dresses was that bridal wear was often a sort of hybrid style, somewhere between evening and day wear. The bodice, for example, was usually made to conform to styles of day wear, with long sleeves and high necklines. Skirts, on the other hand, might sometimes be made with a train, either as part of the skirt itself or separately attached, in the style of formal presentation evening gowns. But other than that, the style of the dress reflected the mode of the day. In the years around World War I, hemlines were just beginning to lift off the floor. And then in the mid to late 1920s, of course, they came right off the floor, almost up to the knee, in a tunic style we now often describe as a, quote, flapper dress. Now, attempts were sometimes made to attach trains to these dresses or incorporate a long veil, as you can see here. Odd as that now actually looks. But the point I'm making is that it clearly didn't occur to any of these brides to dress in anything other than the latest fashion. And that continued through the changing styles of the 1930s as the dress became more form-fitting, the 1940s as the skirts began to blossom out again, the 1950s if we have the sort of reappearance of the crinoline, and to a lesser extent the 1960s. And you can see this very beautiful bridal gown, which was actually a gown of the year in 1966. It's in the collection of the Brighton Historical Society, and a colleague and I actually saw it yesterday. It is the most beautiful thing. Except that as the hemlines of the day dresses rose and then oscillated a bit, but essentially remained well clear of the ground, wedding dresses began to model themselves more on evening gowns, as here. There were some mini-skirted brides in the 1960s and 70s. Here is Paula Durrance, who married David Dunstan in January 1973. Her white sprigged mini dress was in the height of fashion. She teamed it with a wide floppy hat for her ceremony at the Melbourne Mint. But other brides in this period seem to have preferred a version of the Empire line, made long like an evening dress. Here's Linda Blythe, who married Peter Summers in Ballarat in September 1972. Or Lorraine Marsden, who married Tony Wood in April 1973. Both brides made their own dresses, possibly from the same Vogue pattern, although they're slightly different. But shortly after this, the wedding dress seems to have gone off on a trajectory all its own, quite independent of the fashion of the day. Now, perhaps that was because fewer and fewer women wore long evening gowns anymore. Apart from the rich and famous, an evening gown was less likely to be an essential wardrobe item for young women. And so we begin to see silhouettes which are more reminiscent of the 1850s or 1950s replicated in the wedding dress. Think Lady Diana Spencer's extravagant confection in 1981. This is still described, incidentally, as an iconic frock on digital platforms. And frocks like that continued to be offered in bridal shops today, along with other styles more reminiscent of the 1930s and 40s, or indeed much earlier. This particular gown, which I passed on my walk, reminded me of court fashions of the late 17th century. Now, few, if any, of these gowns are likely to have another life after the wedding. So what is it about the white wedding and the extravagant wedding gown that has made it such a resilient cultural form? In earlier times, the wedding was a definite rite of passage, especially for women, marking the sharp transition from maiden to matron. But surely this is no longer the case. One of the most obvious changes to have taken place in the family in the years since the 1980s has been the steady trend towards premarital sexual activity. Most couples have now lived together before marriage, sometimes for extended periods, while some 30% of children are now born out of wedlock, without the stigma attached to earlier generations. So what is it that persuades young women or their parents to part with hundreds or more likely thousands of dollars for a frock to be worn once only? I believe we can see the seeds of this phenomenon emerging much earlier, and it was certainly in place by the years around the Second World War. Now, you'll probably know that during the war in Australia and elsewhere, many items of everyday consumption were rationed. That included many foodstuffs and other essentials like firewood and fuel. But more importantly for our story, it included clothing and fabrics. Citizens were issued with a limited number of food and clothing coupons, and that applied equally to rich and poor. The coupons didn't go far. But we know from the memoirs to have survived from those years that many women felt very strongly about somehow managing to have a white wedding. Young women were told that they would always regret it if they didn't manage to have such a wedding, which would be the, quote, one special day of their lives. And so they scrimped and saved. Families pooled coupons. Women shot for fabric bargains, and those who could sewed their own dresses. And some showed great ingenuity. Elaine Colbert, whose dress is in the Belongings exhibition, saved up coupons to buy the satin fabric for her dress on sale from George's department store. She designed the dress herself, but actually had it made up by a dressmaker. She catered for her own reception in the local church hall. June Burr was even more inventive. She married during the war, while both she and her husband-to-be were still in the services. She was in the Women's Army Service. June made her wedding dress herself from mosquito netting, which was not rationed. And she made a very fine job of it too, as you can see here. It's now in the collection of Museums Victoria. Now, in the 80 or more years since Elaine and June married, the Australian family has changed in hugely significant ways. Both men and women now marry much later than ever before. In 2019, the median age at first marriage for men was 31 and for women, 29. But that partly reflected that other major change in relations between the sexes, which I mentioned before, because by 2019, a majority of couples also lived together before marriage. Estimates suggest that while only about 16% of couples cohabited before marriage in 1975, some 81% did so in 2017. And as many as a third of all children were born out of wedlock by this time, but without the social stigma attached to so-called illegitimate births in previous decades. In past decades, pregnant brides went to great lengths to disguise their condition. Now they are more likely to celebrate the so-called baby bump. Families are also much smaller than they were in past decades. Family size first fell in the closing decades of the 19th century, but it has kept on falling with small blips up and down along the way. Since 1976, Australia's fertility rate has been officially below replacement level, which is estimated to be 2.1 births per woman. There is no indication that that will change anytime soon. Women not only bore fewer children in the early 21st century, they also gave birth much later than in previous generations. In 1981, only 15% of first mothers were aged over 30. By 2019, over half had their first child in their 30s, while 17% were aged over 35. And that's an increase from 5% as late as 1991. Teenage mothers virtually disappeared over the same period. But perhaps the greatest challenge to traditional concepts of marriage and family life has come from changing ideas about who might marry. There was increasing acceptance of same-sex couples from the 1980s, but no popular agreement about whether they should be allowed to marry. Now, ironically, although marriage was always assumed to be the union of a man and a woman, it was not so defined in law, presumably because it never occurred to lawmakers that they needed to do that. The Family Law Act of 1975, for example, referred to marriage as, quote, the union of two people to the exclusion of all others voluntarily entered into for life. As pressure to recognise same-sex marriage increased in the early years of this century, the Conservative Howard federal government introduced an amendment to the Federal Marriage Act, which unequivocally defined marriage as the union of a man and a woman. And it also provided that same-sex marriages entered into under the law of another country would not be recognised in Australia. And that was the Marriage Amendment Bill, which passed in 2004. After 22 failed attempts, that amendment was finally overturned in 2017, when same-sex marriage was legalised, after a voluntary postal vote confirmed that a clear majority of Australians favoured change. Now, marriage ceremonies have changed too, both in their nature and in their location. Although a civil service before a registrar was legal in Victoria from about 1852 or 1853, confirm that. Most couples preferred to be married in a church by a minister of religion, at least for their first marriage. And that continued to be the case until about 1970. But thereafter it changed rapidly. Many more couples began to prefer a location other than a church. Reception centres and gardens became increasingly popular, while the number of registered civil celebrants also expanded. By the year 2000, half of all weddings were conducted by civil celebrants. By 2019, that had reached 80%, in an almost complete reversal of former practice. Now, when Kate Brackett and Anissa Thompson, shown here, married in the midst of the COVID lockdown in 2020, they chose a celebrant to conduct the service in their garden. Now, I'm intrigued that they both chose to wear white blouses, though, perhaps as a tongue-in-cheek nod to traditional practice in this oh-so-modern ceremony of theirs. Now, ironically, despite all these changes, an attachment to the white wedding remains and has even spread from its Anglo-European roots to influence the choices of other cultural groups. You probably know that white is not the preferred colour of celebration in many Eastern cultures. Indeed, in some, it is associated with death and mourning. But adoption of the white wedding dress is growing amongst diverse communities in Victoria as elsewhere. Some still choose to marry in traditional costume. When Mary and Jeremy married at the Old Treasury Building in 2019, for example, May chose to wear a traditional Indian sari in blue silk, while Jeremy wore a formal evening coat in matching dark blue. Some others conduct two ceremonies, one in traditional cultural dress and a second in white. But many brides from culturally diverse backgrounds are married in white at the Old Treasury Building and elsewhere. This couple, for example, married in a church, but came to the Old Treasury Building afterwards for a photo shoot. Now, I was very interested in the clothing that you can see in this photograph, since if you look carefully, you'll see that even the mothers of the bride and groom, you can see them on the left and the right, appear to be dressed exactly alike, suggesting that everything about the dress in this ceremony was choreographed in great detail. Now, on my daily walk each morning, my route regularly takes me along Sydney Road in Brunswick, past a succession of bridal boutiques. Many of these bridal shops specialise in made-to-measure gowns, crafted for the individual bride. Depending on the fabric and the extent of decoration, they can be priced anywhere from $2,000 upwards. $5,000 is not unusual. Now, of course, as we know, the rich and famous notoriously spend much larger sums on their wedding gowns. But these shops cater to otherwise ordinary people on average incomes. So what influences them to spend like this on a dress they will almost certainly wear only once, and then for a few hours only? It all seems to come back to where we began with the title of this talk: a once-in-a-lifetime experience, the chance to be a princess for a day. As you can see from this slide, the bridal houses target their marketing to just this phenomenon. The legend attached to this dress invites the prospective bride to, quote, step into your fairy tale with this enchanting bridal gown. Such a dress as a centerpiece is what is suggested will be, quote, your dream wedding. Now, whether the brides really believe in the happy ever after ending to their stories, we cannot know. But the allure of the fairy tale wedding gown seems to be as powerful now as ever. Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. That was brilliant. While you take a breath, and everyone listening types their questions into the Q&A, I'll let you know about a couple upcoming talks. We're going to keep the fashion theme going with old clothes and new looks, lessons from the past, with Lorinda Kramer on Wednesday, the 23rd of October at 11 a.m. And the next instalment of our Material Histories seminar series, Rediscovering Lost Objects. We'll look at a jug found in the wreck of the Batavia and a Tasmanian rikawa, or a kelp water container, rediscovered 200 years after its collection by French explorers. And that will be on Friday, the 1st of November at 1 p.m. Tickets for both are available on our website and Humanitics page. Now, it struck me that looking at the photos you showed, that perhaps working women were more likely to wear their best frock rather than rich. What do you, would that be your assessment as well, Margie?
Yes, Katie, I think that's probably right. It's very hard to know, of course. And there was one photograph there, and I did pop it in because it was obviously quite a wealthy family locally, where the woman there too was dressed in a coloured dress. But I think almost certainly for working women, the prospect of a white dress was just never going to make sense until much, much later. By the 20th century, I think that it's pretty well universal white. But somewhere in those decades, from the 1880s through to 1900, maybe up to 1920, I think that white is increasingly solidifying as the colour of choice. And for society weddings, I think it's pretty clear that white was absolutely what was expected. And so you get those phrases like, of pure white, or of, the richest bridal gown in cream and satin duchesse and all this sort of thing. And you can clearly see it, I think, in the descriptions too of the weddings, even where there are no photographs. And I do wish that some of those, there were some illustrated newspapers, but most of them weren't at that time, of course, which is such a shame.
How annoying. It's interesting to look at some of the photos. I know they're in black and white, but that some of the attendees appeared to be wearing white, or at least very pale colours.
Well, I think that's right too. And that's another difference, isn't it? Because now, that's where those sorts of things have changed, because now it would be seen as not at all the right thing to wear white. Even if you're attending as, say, the mother of the bride or whatever, to wear white or cream would seem to be in competition with the bride. But I can't now probably go back to those slides, but if you try and think back to those portraits of Queen Victoria and then of she later became Queen Alexandra, all of the attendants seem to be in white with some colour. And from what we can judge, and it is hard to know, that illustration of the governor's daughter from the late 1860s looks very similar, doesn't it, to the photograph, very similar to the Alexandra, Prince Albert grouping and style. And it does look as if the attendants are wearing either white or very light colours.
Mm. Do you think potentially that mirrors fashion rather than bridal per se? I'm thinking of lingerie dresses and that sort of thing in
Yes,
the beautiful.
possibly. It might also have to do with what sort of fabric was around too. And obviously you could get all sorts of sort of sprigged small floral patterns, but that wouldn't be seen probably to be appropriate. And so if you were going for solid fabric of a single color, then you might well go for white at that time if you weren't going to go for a color. It's hard to know, isn't it? I must ask Lorinda Kramer that question actually and see if she knows the answer to that, as to what sort of fabrics were around that weren't sprigged or colored, patterned fabrics. And particularly because women of that class were more likely to be wearing silk. So silk was very unlikely to be pure white, actually. It's much more likely at that time to be, as Queen Victoria's dress was described, as ivory satin. And I suspect that meant a form of cream, really, which was more common. And if you think about those slides that we showed from the National, I think they were both dresses in the National Gallery collection from the 1870s and 80s, both of them are quite cream now. Now that color might have deepened over time, but I suspect that they were not pure white when they started out, because getting pure white in silk or satin was probably more difficult.
Coming back to the extravagant gowns, is the practice of buying expensive bridal gowns related to the fact that fewer women are now experienced dressmakers, do you think?
Well, that might be a factor, Katie. It's really hard to know, isn't it? If you look back over just some of the examples that we have from the 1960s and 70s, then we see these wedding dresses that the brides have made themselves. And they've spent very little money actually on the fabric. I think we know what one of them cost. I can't remember now, but I think it was about $30 or something, which is quite extraordinary. And they managed that because they were competent sewers and because they could get the fabric themselves and make them up. Now, I don't know how many young women now sew, but I think it's a much, much smaller minority. And so the chance of them creating a dress that they would see as being acceptable to wear on an occasion like that is probably less. Now, whether that then means that you then go to the extent, I don't think it explains everything, because I think that the expense of these gowns is just so out of proportion to what you would spend on a normal dress. Well, for an average person in a normal dress, what would that be? I don't know. You might spend a couple of hundred, perhaps, might you? I don't know. You might regularly spend more than that, but you're not so likely, I think, to spend in the thousands. And in particular for a dress that you know you're only going to wear for one occasion. I just find it a really interesting phenomenon. And I'd love to know from people for whom that was part of what they thought was important, what their thinking was. I think you can see some of it in the commentary on the wedding blogs and things. You see, the discussion of my dream wedding and my dream frock. And it does seem to be all about the allure of this, princess for a day. The only opportunity you'll ever have to wear a frock like that, or have an excuse to buy a frock like that and wear it. And so you do.
Yeah. I wonder if there's also an element of I'll spend the money now so that my descendants, will be able to rewear the dress or remake
Oh,
the dress.
well, now that's an interesting thought, Katie. I'd love to know that. Is there much of a second-hand wedding dress market? Now that I don't know, others may. I'd be fascinated to know whether people tend to recycle them, but then whether they keep them to be worn in the family. That'd be very interesting to know. Like, we know some wedding dresses were handed down, although the difference in fashions of the day made that more difficult. in particular, I think. But the styles change so much that it would be quite difficult. But you could hand down the veil, for example, and so that does seem to have happened a little bit, or at least in that one case we know.
Absolutely. It's a lovely little tradition.
It is, isn't it? It's nice. And lots of brides, though, we know, do keep their wedding dresses, but they seem not to have kept them for others to wear. They seem to have kept them more because they treasure them. Or not. I mean, if the marriage ends, presumably you don't keep it. I don't know. But I do know of various people who pack their wedding dresses away in tissue and look after them and keep them.
One last question, talking about re-wearing potentially bridal dresses.
Yes.
Is there much data on second marriages and whether the bride wears white?
Now that's an interesting one. Traditionally, there I am using that word. From around about, say, the mid 20th century onwards, it would have been seen as being a very odd thing for a bride either widowed or, but more particularly divorced because of, all of the scandal that was attached to divorce for a very long time, to wear white. And so many, and even to have worn one of those formal gowns. So you do tend to see that the costumes that are worn for, say, registry office marriages, and most of those weddings at that time had to be in a registry office because the churches wouldn't marry people who'd been divorced anyway. They certainly would marry people who'd been widowed, but not people who'd been divorced until later. And the photographs that you see of people who are married at the, quote, registry office, as it was usually called, tend to be more street clothes. And so a nice suit or a nice dress, but certainly not white. It would have been seen as being very odd if a woman who was either widowed or divorced tried to pass herself off as a bride. But whether that then changed, I don't know. So whether now, for example, having done it all once, if it ends in divorce, do you think, well, I'll have another go and buy the white dress all over again? That I don't know.
It's fascinating to research into.
It would. It would. We need some sociologists to help us.
We do. Anyone listening?
Right. Be a sociologist for a day.
Well, thank you, Margie. We've reached the end of our time. A reminder that our Belongings, Objects and Family Life exhibition is on display at the Old Treasury Building until September next year, that's 2025. And we're open 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Sunday through Friday. Thank you again to everyone watching and to you, Margie. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, Katie.